Well, I have to admit, at the first service we had Dana here, now we don't have anybody. What do you guys want to do? I mean, Ron, Steve, and Ann, no priest. This is a new one for me. Well, honestly, we're wrapping up our sermon series on living from the cross. We've been journeying since just after the New Year, right around January 15th, I think was the first one, through the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul's first letter. Now, except for the brief wandering in the desert we had during Lent. Now we're in the final verses of the final chapter of Paul's letter to the church he had planted in Corinth. And this was a church that was fine while it focused on the cross. But it wasn't fine when it didn't focus on the cross. And Paul calls out several areas. Now, when I first read through these verses, my eyes and my heart jumped when I read verse 13, where Paul says, "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong." So naturally, I thought I'd be preaching about being tougher in our faith, about coming up against sin, coming up against the evil things that corrupt us, resisting evil. I thought I'd be preaching on manning up spiritually, well, discipling up so I don't offend anyone. So in preparing, I decided, well, I better ask for others and get some affirmation. So I asked several guys to go ahead and read through these verses and tell me what they got. Not one of them thought a thing about verse 13. Every one of them said, verse 12. Verse 12 is where Paul speaks of Apollos not coming to Corinth because it wasn't his will. I thought to myself, so I got to preach about a guy with a bad attitude. He doesn't want to show up. So I did a little more research, and it turns out when it says not his will, it's referring to God's will. It wasn't God's will for Apollos to return at that time, but he would return when the opportunity was right. But I wondered why God didn't want Apollos to return to Corinth at that point. I often wonder why God sends some people some places and other people other places. Doesn't always make sense to me. Of course, God doesn't ask my opinion. But I don't understand why some people have to move and some people don't. I don't understand why some people are called to areas and some people are not. Now, I'm familiar with being called. And I'm sure Father Dana, Father Stephen, and Father Ron could fill up hours with their call stories about how they were called into ordained ministry from where they started and where they are today. I do know that being called to anything usually takes us by surprise. Now, I had no idea in 2005 I'd be sitting at Camp St. Christopher reading 1st and 2nd Timothy, and God would say to me, "I'm going to use you as a priest." I'm like, "Sure you are." I never saw it coming. That one day in 2010, I'd come to this church, and in the back hallway, it was the bishop's weekend. In the back hallway, Ron says, "Oh, by the way, we're going to lunch today with the bishop. We're going to talk about you moving forward in the ordination process." I didn't know that was coming. That was surprising. I didn't know that I would be here where I am. I've been taking classes, and I didn't know that I would be standing here in front of you at this point. It's all very surprising. I also know that being called is very humbling and frightening. Any change is frightening. We resist change. But being called also carries with it a real sense of peace. When you take a step in the right direction, you feel that peace come on you. I still remember down at this Hardee's over here, across from Queens Harbor, sitting with Chad Nettie the weekend. This was the week after we'd met with the bishop. We're sitting in the Hardee's, and Chad Nettie were, I think, was it 2010, so they were younger than that now. So they were 12 years old. And we're sitting there over lunch, and I told him that I was called to ordain ministry and that at some point we would have to move as a family to Pittsburgh. They weren't happy about that. They said, "But Dad, why?" And I said to them, "You guys have read you're familiar with Jonah, right?" They said, "Yeah, that's the one that got eaten by the big fish." I said, "Right. They said because he didn't do what God told him to do, he got swallowed by a fish and then vomited out on a shore somewhere. And they said, yeah. And I said, well, I don't want to be the blob of vomit. I need to do this. Now, it turns out that the timing wasn't right. And the bishop and Mara and I decided that we would wait for the boys to get to high school, and then we'll see what happens from that point. But then it's so interesting to go back and look at verse 12. At that point, when I think about that call, why haven't we left for seminary yet? Well, it's not part of God's will for me to have been there yet. The only thing that God asked me to do is to be obedient to the call. And I say me and I mean us. Because it's what Mara and I decided to do when we were on our way down to the Commission on Ministry to talk about becoming a postulant for holy orders. That we didn't know what tomorrow held, but we're going to be obedient to the very next step. And that was all that we could do. I'm a control freak. I wanted to go farther than that. But we just wanted to stay obedient to the next step. And the truth is, I'm talking about my call. And this is only one type of call. And really, honestly, very few of us in this room are going to be called to ordain ministry. There are so many more ways that we are called, every one of us, to ministry. And see, that's the foundation of this letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. Paul was repeatedly and forcefully reminding them, the people of Corinth, that Jesus was calling them to turn away from the things that were not from God and to turn towards the cross, turn back towards God. That's the Christian call. That's the Christian calling. We are first called out, and then we are called in, and then we are called up. Called out, called in, and called up. Now, what do I mean by being called out? Well, this isn't the playground called out, where someone double dog dares you and you get your tongue stuck to a frozen light pole. Now, this is a called out. That's a fancy Greek word, ekklesia or ecclesia, which just simply means the called out ones, and it refers to the church. It refers to what you see here. We're called out. Over and over, the Bible refers to God's people as being separated from the world. Now, for the Israelites, this was a set of traditions and laws in a land that they could call their own. But for Christians, we're called out of the world of flesh. We're called out of the world that serves only us. In fact, in Ephesians, Paul defines Christians as aliens in this world. We don't belong here. This isn't our home. He goes on to call us citizens of the household of God. That's where we belong. We're called out of this world. Now, however it's translated, the truth is that we as Christians are supposed to turn from the ways of the world and turn our eyes to the cross. This is the act of sanctification that Christ made possible for us. On the cross, this is the call to be free from the bondage of sin and the things that entangle us. Galatians chapter 5, verse 13, it tells us that we are called into that freedom. And this is not a freedom that feeds into our own desires. This doesn't give us freedom to do whatever we want. This is a freedom to pursue God's call in our lives, to pursue the best that God has to offer for us. The freedom to live into a new life of Christ. And Paul tells us in other places that we're supposed to live lives that are worthy of this calling. We're supposed to come out of the world. I don't know about you. I don't always live a life that's worthy of my calling. I've been blessed today. I have a couple people here that work with me. They can attest. I have people that live with me that know that I don't always live a life worthy of my call. But we are called to turn away from that sin and then turn towards new life. We're called out of the way that puts us first and called into the household of God that causes us to look to Him first. Jesus is calling us out. See, he doesn't just call us out. I will never leave you and forsake you, he says. God would never call us out and leave us nowhere to go. He called Abraham out of his home, but he prepared a place for him. He called the Israelites out of Egypt, but he prepared the land for them to take. And for us, God has called us out of the world, but he's called us into the church. And one of the best metaphors in the Bible, he calls it the body. Because we're all members of one thing, and we're all intermingled with one another. You heard, I heard. I heard, you heard. We just are that connected. And Paul speaks about this body throughout the book of Corinthians, but he also talks about it in his other letters too. Colossians 3:15. He says that we're called in one body, and because of that, we should be thankful. In Romans 12:5, he tells that we're one body in Christ, and he goes on to say we're members of one another. That's the body. That's what we're called into. We're called out of the flesh and into the body. That's the essence of Christian calling. We are all called into the body, but we're not all called to do the same thing in the body. How boring would church be if we all did the same thing? We'd have 153 guitarists up there. Nobody out here. But make no mistake, we are all called to do something. Now, we covered a lot of ground in the last year or so about spiritual gifts. Corey spoke about some spiritual gifts on the weekend they came back from the mission trip. We did a whole sermon series on Gifted, called Gifted, where we went through the spiritual gifts. The church made available to us a spiritual gifts assessment tool where we were to go on and find out what our gifts are, and then they offered themselves as counselors to help place us into ministries where those gifts would fit. Find out where we're called. Because we're all called to something. And my question to you is, are you living into that call? Matthew 28:19 starts by saying, go therefore. It doesn't say sit therefore. We're supposed to get up and do something. We're supposed to move. And people were blessed with one of the hardest working churches, most volunteering churches I've ever seen in my life. We do more at this church than churches twice our size dare to even think about taking on. But we can do more. We can do more. There are people that can step up more. There are always places to serve that would fit both our passion and our giftedness. Almost every single week we hear of a need in the announcements of something. Today it was handbell, and they need help. They need some handbell ringers. A couple of weeks ago they needed help with AV. There are 4 prayer shawls here. Those don't knit themselves. There are people doing these things. There's a need to be filled somewhere. Big and small, but all very important. Now, if you're already serving in a ministry, thank you. Thank you so much. But if you've hesitated to get involved, please hear that Jesus has called you out of the world and into the body, and now he's calling you up to service. See, it's the dream of every minor league baseball player to be called into the big leagues, to be called up. But this is what we're being called to today. We're being called into greater service. We've been called out of the world and into the body to do something with our lives. We're being called to service. What part of your time, your talents, and your treasure have you been holding back? Maybe you're called to pray for others, but you've never looked into the intercessory prayer ministry. Maybe you're called to lead, but you've never dropped your name in the hat to run for vestry. Maybe you're called to start a small group, to host some people, clean up after an event. Maybe you're good with children. You're called to work in the nursery or children's chapel. Those are all items that are inside the church. Let's wander outside the walls. Maybe you're called to visit people in prison in the Kairos ministry. Maybe you're called to mission work. Maybe you're called to be a big brother, big sister. Something. You're being called to do something. Christ is calling you to the big leagues. Or maybe, just maybe, you're keeping ministry at arm's length. I'm doing just enough to satisfy my curiosity, but I'm not living fully into what God has to offer through me. Well, if that's the case, then I urge you to up your game. Step it up. Think about responding to something bigger, because we're all in this together. We are called out, and we are called in, and we are called up. But I got to tell you, the most important one is to be called out. You know, throughout this book, Paul's worked diligently on getting people to turn their eyes away from the world and to turn them towards Jesus. He's urged them to turn toward the cross. You know, when Paul spoke about people taking a flippant attitude towards communion, he didn't just chastise them. He reminded them about the sacrifice that Christ made for them on the cross. When he spoke about the divisions among them, I think we know a little bit about division. When he spoke about division, he didn't concentrate on it. He just turned them towards the cross. And idol worship, folks, we all have idols that we worship. We follow things that take our eyes off God. Paul says, turn back to the cross. For anyone suffering from sexual immorality, God says, turn your eyes upon the cross and his redemption. And anybody that's in pain and suffering, the cross is there. And in all those places where maybe you feel like you've failed, you've let your family down, you've let your children down, your spouse down, your friends down, or you've ignored God's call on your life, the cross is calling. Jesus is calling us to come to the altar and turn our eyes upon him. I urge you today, if you've got anything to lay down, to don't let today go by. Jesus is calling. Amen.